Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Peace has been a stranger to the Middle East, held at bay by conflicting passions, selfish ambitions, and missed opportunities. History itself is an active voice in the ongoing drama of the region because the lengthening record of recriminations and vulnerabilities makes it difficult for Israelis and Palestinians to imagine a shared future. But past disappointment in no way lessens the obligation of the international community to search for a lasting settlement, a search that is particularly incumbent upon the United States of America. For despite its conflicted history, the region's future is, after all, still unwritten. Wise initiatives, sustained attention, and most importantly, the energies of its emerging young people may yet spell a brighter future for Arab and Jew alike. My guest is Aaron David Miller, author, analyst, and advisor to 6 Secretaries of State. Formerly president of the international youth organization Seeds of Peace, Aaron Miller is currently a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Aaron, welcome to Dialogue.
It's a pleasure to be here, George.
My pleasure, absolutely. I'm sure you'd agree with me, Aaron, that the Middle East is a region that does not lack for sudden and dramatic critical developments and crises. And perhaps the most recent and significant of these has been, to use a phrase, the emergence of the non-state actor as a party to all that's going on this year. I think, obviously, of Hezbollah and the military confrontation it had with Israel for several weeks this summer. And then on the other hand, there's Hamas, which is a dominant player now in the Palestinian parliament. These non-state actors, Aaron, to what extent do they make a very complex situation even more so, or perhaps just plain confused?
I think the presence of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah who are prepared, ideological in nature, and who are prepared to use violence, even terror against civilians to accomplish their objectives, complicates a picture that is already, frankly, very unfortunate during the past 5 years. And the reality, unless you have the mainstreams in these societies committed to negotiating a just, equitable, and durable peace, then it seems to me the prospects for any leader, an Israeli or Palestinian one, acting to diffuse what is essentially an existential conflict, sadly from the perspective of the Arabs and the Israelis, are pretty remote. And we've seen Hamas and Hezbollah complicate the situation both in Lebanon and in Gaza.
I appreciate that answer, and I specifically want to talk to you about the leadership of both Israel and Palestine in confronting organizations like this. You know, and I know you know this very well, people love to look for winners and losers in the wake of conflicts like the one we saw in Lebanon. I think that's probably a little facile and futile. But if you had to cite a trend, like, for example, Hezbollah, is there any sense in which it's been strengthened by the fact that it could stand off a major state for that long?
Well, Lebanon is not the World Series, and it won't be decided by points or runs scored. But I think, like many conflicts in this region, perception may well be more important than reality. The fact that the Israelis succeeded in degrading and undermining the Hezbollah infrastructure, killing a third of their fighters, destroying much of their long-range and even middle-range Katyusha rocket capability, may be important. But in a region in which perception is more important than reality, I'm not so sure it is. Frankly, on the day before the ceasefire, Hezbollah succeeded in launching more rockets into northern Israel than any time during the confrontation, which endured for almost a month. Right. That's not an example of an organization that is no longer viable. It's not an example of an organization that has been defeated. So I think from that perspective, it was a loss. Israel went into this operation to restore its lost strategic deterrence, and I'm afraid it emerged with at best a tie. And for the Israeli Defense Forces, whose record is far more proficient than ties, I think this was perceived to be a significant blow.
I appreciate that as well, Aaron, and I agree very much with your point that perceptions in that region, perhaps everywhere in the world, but certainly in that region, are extremely important factors. What's the perception then, and I promise to talk about leadership, of Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, in the wake of this? I mean, he was confronted with what may be an unprecedented crisis in the Hezbollah attack upon Israel, But it seems to me, at least as an outsider, there was considerable controversy within Israel about his conduct of the conflict itself and its aftermath.
I don't think there's any question about that. And frankly, now that the Israeli-Lebanese war is over, the Israeli against Israeli war has begun on so many levels, the political level, the military level, and even the level of whether or not the government and state of Israel was able to minister to the needs of its northern communities, which suffered so, not to mention, obviously, damage and huge loss of life on the Lebanese side. So I think success, frankly, in my book, is the world's most compelling ideology. Not nationalism, not communism, not democracy, not even capitalism. Because success generates power, and it generates constituents. And the perception, frankly, with respect to Mr. Olmert, is that he did not succeed. And for a prime minister that succeeded a man who had tremendous authority and legitimacy, Ariel Sharon, a man of great controversy, particularly when it came to Lebanon, for whom Lebanon, frankly, as you know, was a fatal attraction in 1982. For Mr. Olmert, I'm afraid Lebanon appeared to be and was a fatal distraction.
Your reference here, of course, is to Ariel Sharon, who had a very problematic intervention in Lebanon 20 years ago, but over the course of the last 20 years emerged as a very strong leader in Israel and a tough act to follow.
And I think in the end what has really determined Olmert's loss of direction is the reality that in the wake of Lebanon and Hezbollah's success in literally turning Israel into two countries, one north of Haifa where things were functioning abnormally and one south where things functioned reasonably normally, the notion that Israel will be able now unilaterally, as Sharon had begun in Gaza, to withdraw from West Bank territory, which the so-called realignment plan, which was Mr. Olmert's raison d'etre for his Kadima party, that is now simply a memory.
Well, let us focus on that, because I think you've used the phrase in some of the things you've written in the past of coordinated unilateralism. That is to say, Israel, to use an example, withdrew from Gaza and withdrew from Lebanon, actually. And these are kind of, by coordinated unilateralism, I think the meaning is positive acts taken independently with the hope something may come of them.
Yes, I think that's a...
Is that a good definition?
That's a reasonable interpretation.
But what you're saying is we can forget about that happening on the West Bank now.
Right. Now, some people will say that's good, because unilateralism, after all, was the default position. I mean, for 30 years, and I worked for almost 20 of them for 6 secretaries of state, the paradigm governing the Arab-Israeli conflict, the resolution of that conflict, was a negotiated solution with reciprocity. And in the wake of the failed Camp David summit in July of 2000, the beginning of the worst Israeli-Palestinian confrontation in 50 years, the notion of a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians appeared to be mortally wounded. So unilateralism emerged as a default position. But now even that, in the wake of the Lebanon war, seems to be a bankrupt idea. So we're stuck, basically. And being stuck in this conflict means only one thing: additional violence and protracted confrontation.
But also being stuck could mean that we're just going to remain stuck. I mean, it seems to me you're talking about the possible sacrifice of the original, what I call classic idea, the two-state solution negotiated, each state living side by side in peace. Now, if that's out the window, and coordinated unilateralism is out the window, then it's possible, at least, for us to exist continually in this kind of fragmented, indecisive
state. With the forces of history, sadly, becoming the arbiter of what's possible, or more likely what's impossible. Demography, increasing numbers of Palestinians as a consequence of birth rates among Palestinian women in the West Bank and Gaza will, even by the most conservative demographic experts' estimations, somewhere around 2015 result in or 2020 result in an Arab majority in those areas between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River.
Which, of course, would raise the identity crisis for the state of Israel, wouldn't it? I mean, if it had as the Arab population is bound to grow, it does increase, I think, some pressure on Israel to define what kind of state it's going to be in the wake of that.
What kind of state it's going to be and where it is. I mean, Israel is 58 years old, and yet its boundaries nor its identity, neither its boundaries nor its identity has been fundamentally determined. Now, that may not be unusual. It took us a civil war and westward expansion and a civil rights movement even to begin to determine our identity as a nation. But the Israelis have an additional problem, which is the presence of over 1 million Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who do not live in the West Bank and Gaza, who Israel has no constitution, but who are accorded equal rights under the law, and yet they suffer systemic social and economic discrimination. And that's a huge problem for a state already grappling with these other issues.
And a huge challenge for Israeli leadership. And I think the question of leadership is fundamental to what we're talking about right now, the capacity of both these populations to get beyond this. Because demographics, Aaron, I think works and can work in a very positive way as an inducement to try to reach accommodations and settlements. You've got the demographics you mentioned about the Arab population in Israel and surrounding areas growing. But also, it would seem to me the Palestinians face this tremendous growth of unemployed youth, dissatisfied youth, etc. Two demographic pressures that could lead to some positive
It's a very
outcome.
good point, and it's already had an impact on a Hamas government that won fair and free democratic elections and now is under great pressure to be successful, to produce. And I think the national unity government that's now in formation between Fatah and Hamas under the rubric, or under the auspices of the PLO, is exactly confirmation of your point. Hamas is under pressure. Whether or not it will create a sort of transformation which would allow an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation on the four core issues, Jerusalem borders, refugees, and security, is another matter. But these pressures do mount. Leadership, however, is the sine qua non. Because Arab-Israeli peacemaking is so hard, it's already led to the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981, Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995. It's not a matter of political risk, it's a matter of physical risk. Because it's so hard, it requires leaders with authenticity, legitimacy, and tremendous courage. And I'm afraid, and I suspect I fear this the most, that we are now out of the age of what I would describe to you as heroic politics in Arab-Israeli peacemaking. And that, if in fact it's true, is a sad commentary in the future.
That may be the biggest indictment of all. Because when you mentioned Yitzhak Rabin, we're 11 years after his tragic assassination. He was a pragmatist, a former military man who was willing to take some risks and accomplish things. Now we have Mahmoud Abbas on the one hand, Ehud Olmert on the other. And if they're not up to that, if they're not capable of that kind of heroic leadership, and neither man I don't think is remarkable for charisma, then where do we go?
I think that's right. Even if you could argue that both Abbas and Olmert have the incentive to enter into serious negotiations, the question is whether they have the power. Because you need both. You need the will to do it, and you need the capability. One without the other simply will not work. And at the moment, we don't have those conditions.
Can these two men, even with their limitations, and I think this has been a critical comment, but deserved a correct one, can they reach an accommodation? Can they make something happen, however modest, that's progressive?
You know, nobody ever lost money betting against Arab-Israeli peace. The last diplomatic mission I was on before I resigned from the State Department in January of 2003, I said to Tony Zinni, who was then Colin Powell's special envoy, and we were heading out to try to negotiate an Israeli-Palestinian ceasefire under the worst possible circumstances. I said to General Zinni, I said, nobody ever lost money betting against Arab-Israeli peace, and that's certainly true. But I think there is the makings of a deal. It's what I would call a stabilization arrangement. And it would have at least three elements. Number one, a comprehensive ceasefire, which would essentially mean Palestinian attacks in Israel and within the West Bank and Gaza would cease. All Israeli offensive military actions would cease as well. That's point number one. Number two, both sides would begin to cooperate either directly or through coordinated unilateralism to allow the economic life that is critical to raising the standards of living, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, to reemerge. If you can't move people and goods, you have no economy. It's that simple. And third, and this I would phrase as a question, is it conceivable to begin to introduce into the equation negotiations, perhaps over an additional Israeli redeployment from the West Bank, perhaps the notion of a Palestinian state with provisional borders? Is it possible to begin to get into some of the political issues? If between now and the end of this administration, and I only mention that because this administration will have to take a much more assertive role if even this stabilization package is to materialize. If that were the goal between now and January of '09, it would be an extraordinary legacy for this administration to leave against the backdrop of terror and violence.
Given what you said, Aaron, in the absence of heroic leadership, I think it would be a stunning accomplishment if we could get these three principles: stop the fighting, get the economics moving, and then perhaps get into meaningful negotiations. That would be a 1, 2, 3 major step for this less heroic age.
Right, and it would also be a wonderful, wonderful addition.
All right, since you're talking about these 3 possible steps to be taken between now and 2009, you're introducing here the role that Washington should play. So let's talk a bit about that. What are the points, because a lot of people say, and I think you're one of them, that the administration's turned its attention away from this in favor of Iraq. I mean, what are the principles of helpful Washington?
Well, governing is about choosing. That's what it means to govern. It means to determine, I don't care if it's Indonesia or Switzerland, it doesn't matter. Governments set priorities, and they choose. This administration has articulated 3 priorities for itself: Iraq, the war against terror, and Iran. It has chosen not to stress this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that's the first principle. The President of the United States must make a judgment
that this a priority.
That this issue is a priority, and make it unmistakably clear within his own government and abroad that he cares about this, he's committed to it, he doesn't have unrealistic expectations, but he's prepared to work at it. That's the first issue. Second, you're going to need a structure.
Right.
This is not weekend work. You don't subcontract this out, which frankly, and I worked for the administration for Colin Powell for 2 years, the administration has tried to subcontract out the Arab-Israeli peace process. You can't do it. Now, that doesn't mean the President has to be the desk officer to manage this.
But the Secretary of State.
The Secretary of State needs to take it under his or her wing, and if possible, to find an envoy, representative of the President, someone with political cachet and power to be taken seriously by the Arab Israelis, because if these envoys are not, the Arabs and the Israelis, frankly, will grind them up.
Right, right. You have to have respect.
You need respect, and you need to reflect the words and power of the presidency. And then 3, you need to work this issue. We don't do conventional diplomacy anymore on this issue. There may be every legitimate reason or excuse as to why, but we need to. The roadmap is a perfectly fine document for one thing, except for one thing. There's no self-implementing document that I'm aware of in the history of the Arab-Israeli peacemaking.
Kind of like an unfunded mandate.
It has to be worked.
And working it, does that mean, for example, talking to Iranians and talking to Syrians on the part of the American administration?
Right now, I think it means finding a way to get Israelis and Palestinians into a meaningful dialogue and to have the United States play a role in that. You know, success may be exceeding expectations in this regard. I would set my expectations very low. I wouldn't crowd the administration's plate now by trying to open up direct dialogues with Damascus and Tehran. It's going to be tough enough, given Hamas's refusal to meet the conditions set by not just the United States, but by the Quartet, by the Russians, the EU, the UN, and the Americans. Recognition of Israel, no violence, and the acceptance of all agreements signed between Israel and the PLO. It's going to be hard enough to finesse that problem. So, but I think it can be worked, because Mahmoud Abbas as president can be the address with whom the administration deals.
I think you're talking about realism here. It seems to me that if you look at some of the past euphoric moments in the last 20 years, for example, Oslo, the process, some could criticize that as having been overly sentimental. Maybe we're all friends now, great things are going to happen. They didn't. And then more recently, at the end of the Clinton administration, when everyone got together at Camp David, there were high hopes, perhaps romantic hopes that couldn't be realized. I think you're talking about something very basic, progressive, and moving in the right direction, with a lot of sustained attention.
Right. But realism is absolutely critical, because there's one thing we have to accept, and there's no way we can change this. It is not the initiative of the United States that can create the circumstances for breakthroughs. Every breakthrough in the Middle East has occurred through one of the locals or another, either responding sadly with violence or with some heroic act of diplomacy. The United States, once those opportunities are present, with tenacity and toughness and a good sense of timing, can find a way to orchestrate them and to actually be there as a broker and as a friend. But this is a question, frankly, of tremendous political will, because nobody is going to plant a tree in your honor if you succeed in Arab-Israeli peacemaking. Nobody.
I like that word, broker. We've heard that a million times. I mean, that's been the traditional hoped-for role. How important is it for the U.S. to come across, to the Arab world in particular, as balanced, as and to use the pejorative phrase, not Israel's lawyer, that you hear sometimes in Arab countries?
Right. Well, that's a phrase, frankly, that I used in a Washington Post op-ed in May of 2005, for which I've taken enormous grief. But it's such a common sense position. If you want an agreement, you meet the needs of both sides. I don't care if it's a good marriage, if it's a good friendship, if it's a good business proposition. The needs of both sides need to be met. Arab-Israeli peacemaking isn't much different. So we can't be a lawyer for the Arabs or for Israel. We need to be a lawyer or an attorney for the process as a whole. And I would argue to you that the three Americans who have done the most consequential diplomacy, two Republican secretaries of state, Henry Kissinger, James Baker, one Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, understood the importance of being, it's not the honest broker, it's the effective broker. Because one of the reasons the Arabs come to us is because we have this relationship with Israel.
And you can get things done.
Yeah, our phone wouldn't be ringing at all if we didn't have an intimate relationship with the state of Israel. The problem is, frankly, we can overdo it, and we can allow Israeli needs and sensitivities. In short, George, we could allow the special relationship, which we have and must maintain, to become the exclusive relationship. And when that happens, we will fail.
So if we're a lawyer or a broker, our client is peace.
Our client, and I would like to use the word peace, our client right now is effective agreements that could end conflict and perhaps set the stage for normalization between Arabs and Israelis, and one day, maybe for my kids' kids, the kind of peace that Arabs and Israelis deserve.
Well, that's a much more pragmatic, and I think throughout this, your emphasis has been on the hard-headed, the progressive, the incremental, but always moving in the right direction. Against all of that, and I think that's well taken, as we both know, we're sitting here, we hear a lot about democracy philosophically as the great theme, the great issue in the Middle East. And one of the tragedies, Aaron, or at least one of the problematic outcomes of the Lebanon situation was that a year ago when we talked about Lebanon, it was because of the great elections and the movement toward democracy in the Middle East. Two questions. Has that now been somehow suspended or hurt by what's going on in Lebanon? And how important is it? And is it realistic to think that we're going to get that kind of widespread democracy throughout the region in our lifetimes?
Since 1950, Freedom House reports that there have been 22 countries in the world that have maintained their democratic character. Only 22. Only 22. Now,
I hope we're one.
We can talk, yes, we are. We can talk all day long about emerging democracies, but it is time that is the ultimate arbiter of whether a state maintains its democratic character. I don't want to create the sense that democratization is impossible in these regions. It's certainly not, but it's going to take an enormous amount of time. And the Arab-Israeli conflict, frankly, detracts and undermines this drive toward respect for human rights, pluralism, and good government. And I'll give you, I'll give you one example. During the Clinton administration, we put the needs of the Arab-Israeli peace process, which depended very much on Mr. Arafat, ahead of pushing for human rights, pushing against corruption, which we rarely did, pushing against state security courts, which Mr. Arafat used in order to prosecute without due process Palestinians. There was a trade-off there.
We sacrificed all of that.
Well, at least we didn't begin to put it on the agenda. And I have to say, the administration, which is an administration of very big ideas, even though they may not have the means to accomplish them, and when they try, sometimes it hardly turns out the way we want it, or frankly, what may well be in the interest of the United States. But the administration has put the democratization issue on the agenda, and I have to say, no administration, I've worked for 5 of them, ever took this one on. So with respect to station identification, the administration deserves credit for that.
Right. But I think your deeper message here, you're giving credit where it's due, but to pragmatism, which you've been emphasizing, I add patience also as something that we have to be.
I think so, because I measured my life in government in terms of administrations. In the region, it's generations. And that issue of time is a critically important variable as we assess the threats and opportunities that we face.
Because you mentioned generations as we come to the end of our conversation, Aaron, I want you to use that theme of generations to focus on something you've been doing with equal passion, and that, of course, is your work with the Seeds of Peace. Now, this is an organization that brings Palestinian and Israeli youth and youth from other conflicting areas takes them out of that situation to the greatest extent possible so they can meet each other. How's that doing? What's the hope for that? What do you expect of them? We've been very hard-headed throughout this conversation. What do you want that to achieve?
Well, you know, John Kennedy was the first president to cross my political consciousness, and John Kennedy, I was 13 when he was assassinated, described himself as an idealist without illusion. That's how I think we have to look at this problem. Never give up on the prospects and the possibilities of peace, but do so with your eyes open. And Seeds of Peace is an example of an organization, I think, that does that. It knows it cannot change the situation on the ground. It knows it can't instantly transform young minds that have been corrupted and perverted as a consequence of conflict. But it begins to take young Israelis and Palestinians, Indians and Pakistanis, out of their Egyptians and Jordanians, out of their environment. It brings them to the United States for 3 weeks, and you watch an extraordinary transformation occur in these young people. They don't give up their political views, but what they do is make an allowance for the other's narrative alongside of their own. And they hear this narrative not from a rabbi or a priest or an imam. They hear this narrative from a peer whose humanity and friendship they simply cannot deny or ignore. And it's one of the most powerful transformations. We just need more of it.
I agree. We need a lot more of it. And Aaron Miller, thank you so much for being with us here today, both for the words about the region and the words about Seeds of Peace.
Thank you, George.
Very much. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at Dialogue at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching. Aaron, thank you for talking.
Thank you.